A pretty important factor is the amount. You know, if the smaller the percentage of the work, the more likely it's to be viewed as a fair use. You know, if you take a sentence or two and quote it and attribute it to something, then that will generally be considered fair use. A good example is Google and the search engines. You know, showing the title of a page and a few sentences around what was searched for, that's generally considered fair use of that information. But taking the whole article and reproducing it in its entirety is generally would not be argued as fair use. But there are some examples where taking something in entirety is okay. Test cases around someone recording a television show so that they could replay it back for themselves for their personal use later. That's making a copy of its entirety, but that's considered fair use to do that. Another example is taking a photo and making a thumbnail picture of the photo to use in search results. That's generally considered fair use, even though the whole original is there. In some sense, the data's been reduced and the image isn't usable in the same way the original image was used. And it's accomplished something that's in the common good in terms of enabling people to find things and go to the source for the material. But it can be that a very small percentage of a work is a copyright infringement. There's one example where there was 400 words from a full-length book, and those 400 words got at the heart of what the book was, and that was held to be copyright infringement. So it's really, are you misappropriating all of what's there, or are you just taking a little bit to give a hint and then giving credit back to the source? The last is the effect on the work's value. Does the use that you make of it harm the original owner? And it's not just whether it actually caused harm, but if that use was widespread, would it cause harm in the marketplace? There are certain things that are excluded. You know, this is an area where in the United States there's a little bit more liberal view than there is in other countries in the world. Because of freedom of speech considerations, there's a great deal of latitude given under fair use in the US for creating parodies, and you can do more in that context than you could in some other countries. And so the damage that's caused by writing a negative review and incorporating some information at the same time, that's not a factor in whether something's fair use or not. There is a difference between commercial use of something and non-commercial use. You know, we're all in the commercial business, so what that means is when we're using content on websites that we're trying to make money off, if there is a lawsuit raised, then the burden of proof that something is a fair use rests on the webmaster using that information. If it's a nonprofit type of use, for example, in an educational context, then the burden of proof that something fair resides on the copyright holder to show that that was the case. Okay. So I'm going to go through and give some examples. These are examples that I've seen webmasters ask about. A lot of webmasters, before they understand the rules here, think it's okay to publish a work as long as I link to it, that it's, you know, helping the person who wrote the article in the first place. I'm giving them a backlink. That's good from an SEO perspective. They should be happy I'm taking their article and backlinking to them. That's definitely a copyright violation unless the author gave you permission to do that. But if an author doesn't give permission, there's basically no circumstances in which case it's okay to take an article as a whole and reproduce it on your website and give a backlink in exchange and take the view that that's fair use because you're giving them something back. It's not what's fair in your mind. What matters is what the copyright holder is allowing you to do. Another example is people think of Wikipedia as being a source that's publicly constructed and that anyone can take and copy from. And generally, there is a lot of freedom to take a material from Wikipedia, but on Wikipedia, every page of Wikipedia identifies what the copyright restrictions are. And generally, there are restrictions of different sorts. One common restriction is that you have to cite the source that the material came from. And another common requirement is the copyright message that's on the original article has to be carried with the article when you reprint it. So generally, you can use information from there in almost all cases, but there are restrictions and requirements for what you have to do in order for your use of it to be permitted by the copyright holder, which is the Wikipedia organization. Sometimes webmasters think, do I have to follow every condition that the author says? I don't think some of them really matter. And the answer is, the author grants permission for you to use an article, and the author can place whatever conditions they want on that. It's your decision whether you want to abide by those restrictions or not. If you don't, then you don't have the right to use the article or the materials. Common examples are there's article sources like ArticleBase and eZine articles. And those articles generally have restrictions that the links that are in the articles remain in place exactly as they are. Sometimes webmasters will take those articles and remove the links because they don't want them there. That's a copyright violation. You don't have the right to do that. Let's see. There are, the license terms can be complicated around use of articles. And as a webmaster, to try and keep them all straight can seem like it's a lot of work. It's usually not quite as much work as it seems like, because there are some common licensing terms called the Creating Common license. Wikipedia uses those, for example. And if you understand what those license terms are, then you might find the words in lots of different websites, and there are, long legal paragraphs to read, but as long as you understand what those licenses are, you can understand it once, and then references to those license types. You don't have to reread the material or understand it in detail every time. There are 6 main types of licenses related to or Creative Commons licenses. There are things like if the work needs to be attributed, whether it can be shared without noting the license on the page that you create or not, whether it can be used commercially, are some examples. So if you are in your business want to make use of materials on other sites, I'd recommend reading and understanding the requirements of the Creative Commons licenses, because it'll make your job easier if you understand what that is in terms of knowing what you can and can't do. Another question we have is, do copyrights have to be registered? And in all the countries that are a party to the Berne Convention, the answer is no. There are a few countries that aren't parties to that where you have to state that material is copyrighted, so it's pretty common for people to put copyright messages on things, but in most of the countries of the world, you don't have to put any copyright notice on something for it to be copyright protected.